All right, today we're talking about something that really sticks with you. And this is the story of Terry Caskey, who was a medic and operating room technician in Vietnam. And honestly, when you hear what this 20-year-old kid went through in those field hospitals, working on casualties day after day with no let-up, it kind of makes you realize that the combat troops weren't the only ones seeing the absolute worst of that war. Terry Caskey wanted to be a medic ever since he was a kid, watching the old TV series Combat. You know, that black and white show from the 1960s about World War II infantry. And something about the medics on that show, the guys who were running into danger to help wounded soldiers, that spoke to him in a way that stuck. He didn't just want to be a soldier. He wanted to be the guy who saved soldiers, who gave them a chance to survive when they got hit. And that became his goal. And here's the thing. Caskey didn't just accept that he might end up in Vietnam, actually wanted to go there. Wanted to go specifically because that's where American soldiers were getting wounded and needed medics. And if he was going to be a medic, well, that's where he needed to be. So, he enlists, goes through his training, and the Army gives him dual military occupational specialties. He's both a combat medic, the guy who'd go out with infantry units and treat casualties in the field, and an operating room technician, which meant he could also work in surgical hospitals assisting with operations. That's a lot of training, a lot of responsibility. And it meant the Army could use him in different capacities depending on where he was needed most. Caskey gets his orders for Vietnam in July 1968. And this is significant timing because the summer of 1968 was right after the Tet Offensive, which happened in late January and early February of that year. And the casualties from that and the ongoing fighting were absolutely overwhelming the medical system in Vietnam. The field hospitals and evacuation hospitals were seeing a massive flow of wounded. The medical personnel were stretched thin, and they needed every trained medic and OR technician they could get. Before shipping out to Vietnam, Caskey gets some on-the-job training at the Fort Campbell Military Hospital in Kentucky. You know, working in an actual hospital with real patients to supplement his formal training, getting some experience before he's thrown into the chaos of a combat zone hospital. Then, it's time to go, and he flies off to Vietnam, probably on one of those chartered civilian airliners that the military used to transport troops to and from the war, packed in with a couple hundred other guys all heading to the same place. When the plane lands, probably at Cam Ranh Bay, which was one of the major arrival points for American personnel, and Caskey steps out of the airplane door, he's immediately struck by two things: the overwhelming heat and the awful smell. The heat in Vietnam, especially in the summer, it's just brutal. It hits you like a wall, humid and oppressive. Nothing like what most American kids from stateside had ever experienced. And you're sweating before you've even walked down the steps of the plane. And the smell. That's something almost every Vietnam veteran mentions. Vietnam had a distinctive smell, a combination of fish sauce and wood smoke and human waste and tropical vegetation and jet fuel and whatever else was in the air. And it was just overpowering, especially when you first arrived. Caskey gets assigned to a MASH-type field hospital in Phu Bai, which was up in the northern part of South Vietnam in what they called One Corps, the area closest to the DMZ and North Vietnam. And this was one of the most dangerous and heavily contested areas of the country. Phu Bai was a major base. It had an airfield. It had the 22nd Surgical Hospital, which was one of those mobile surgical units similar to the MASH units from Korea, set up in tents or temporary structures, designed to be close to the fighting so they could receive and treat casualties quickly. But before Caskey can get to Phu Bai, he has to wait at Cam Ranh Bay for days, waiting for transport north. And this was typical. You'd arrive in Vietnam and then spend days or even weeks at a replacement depot waiting for orders and transportation to your actual unit. Just sitting around in the heat, getting used to being in a war zone, hearing the sounds and seeing the activity, but not yet doing your actual job. Finally, Kasky gets his transport north, flies up to Phu Bai, and when he arrives, there's a mortar attack going on. Welcome to Phu Bai. Here's your introduction to what life is going to be like for the next year. The enemy, both Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars, they could hit Phu Bai with mortars and rockets pretty much whenever they wanted. They had positions in the hills around the base, and they'd just lob rounds in, sometimes at predictable times, like meal times or shift changes when they knew people would be concentrated, sometimes randomly, and you never knew when it was coming. You'd just hear the whistle or the explosion, and you'd have to hit the ground or run for a bunker. The airport terminal at Phu Bai, Kasky noticed it was ventilated with bullet holes, which tells you something about what that place had been through. The terminal had been shot up, probably during Tet, when the NVA and VC attacked bases all over South Vietnam. And they hadn't bothered to repair it, just left the bullet holes there, because what was the point? It was just going to get shot up again anyway. So Kasky arrives at the 22nd Surgical Hospital, and he starts working. And the flow of wounded is immense and never-ending. This is a field hospital, close to the fighting. When guys get hit, they get medevaced in by helicopter, sometimes within minutes of being wounded, and they come in needing immediate surgery or immediate stabilization before they can be sent to a larger hospital farther south. Kasky is working in the operating room as a technician, which means he's assisting the surgeons, handing them instruments, managing equipment, helping with whatever they need. And he's seeing the most horrific wounds you can imagine. Guys torn apart by explosions, riddled with shrapnel, missing limbs, massive trauma. And he's 20 years old, trying to process all of this while staying functional and doing his job. The operating room at a field hospital in Vietnam, it's not like a modern American hospital where everything is sterile and controlled and you do one surgery at a time. No, you've got multiple tables going, multiple casualties being worked on simultaneously, blood everywhere, the smell of it, the sounds of it, the chaos, and you're working for hours and hours straight because the casualties keep coming and you can't stop. You can't take a break. These guys will die if you don't work on them right now. The enemy attacks on Phu Bai were relentless. Kasky said he could watch rockets fire off from a nearby hilltop and track the contrail right into his compound, which is a terrifying thing. You see the rocket launch. You see it coming towards you, and there's nothing you can do but hope it doesn't land on you. Sometimes it hit the hospital compound. Sometimes it hit nearby, and the medical personnel just had to keep working through it, had to keep operating on the wounded even while the base was under attack. Because what else are you going to do? You can't abandon the patients on the tables. Kasky remembers one shift, an epic shift in the operating room. Probably 12 hours or more of continuous surgery, working on casualty after casualty. And when he finally emerged from the OR, he was covered in blood, absolutely covered. And he was 20 years old, and it was too much to bear. Think about that. You're barely out of high school. You're in a war zone. You're working on dying and horribly wounded men for hours on end. You're exhausted. You're emotionally drained. You've seen things that no human being should have to see, and you still have to get up the next day and do it again. That's what the medical personnel in Vietnam dealt with. That's the psychological burden they carried. And a lot of them Like Kasky, it affected them deeply and permanently. At some point, Kasky gets transferred to the 95th Evacuation Hospital in Da Nang, and the first thing that happens when he gets there is a rocket attack that ruptures his eardrums. Just like that, he's wounded. Probably not seriously enough to be evacuated out of Vietnam, but his eardrums are ruptured, which is painful and disorienting and can cause permanent hearing damage. And this is just from being in the wrong place when a rocket hits. The 95th Evacuation Hospital was a step up from the field hospital in Phu Bai. It was in a real building instead of tents. It had flush toilets instead of latrines. It was more established, more permanent. And for someone who'd been living and working in the primitive conditions at Phu Bai, the 95th probably felt almost luxurious by comparison, even though it was still a combat zone hospital subject to enemy attacks. Da Nang was a major base, much larger than Phu Bai. It had the biggest airfield in First Corps, huge logistics facilities, thousands of American personnel, and the 95th EVAC was one of the main hospitals in the northern part of South Vietnam, handling casualties not just from the immediate area, but from all over First Corps. The hours at these military hospitals were brutal. The staff worked incredibly long shifts, sometimes days straight with no sleep, because the casualties kept coming and there weren't enough medical personnel to handle the load. Kasky recalls one wounded soldier in particular, a guy who stepped on a landmine. And this is one of the signature injuries of the Vietnam War. Landmines were everywhere. The VC and NVA used them extensively. And when you stepped on one, it would blow your foot or leg off, sometimes both legs, sometimes more. This soldier that Kasky remembers underwent multiple amputations. They're trying to save his life, trying to stop the bleeding and treat the shock and remove the destroyed tissue. And they have to amputate what's left of his legs, maybe an arm too. And you're working on this guy, knowing that even if he survives, his life is changed forever. He's going to be a multiple amputee, and he's probably 19 or 20 years old, just a kid. Kasky worked on this soldier, was part of the team trying to save him, and that image, that memory, it stayed with him for decades. Years later, he's back in the States, probably living a normal civilian life, and he sees photos from that day, photos of that soldier or that operation, and it sets off a PTSD episode. Post-traumatic stress disorder. That's what happens when you've experienced traumatic events that your brain can't fully process. And seeing those photos brought it all back, triggered all the memories and emotions he'd been suppressing or trying to manage, and he had a breakdown. But here's the important part. That PTSD episode resulted in him finally getting the needed help from the VA, finally getting into treatment, finally starting to address the psychological wounds he'd been carrying all those years. A lot of Vietnam veterans didn't get help, didn't seek it, or didn't get it when they did. But Kasky eventually did, and that probably saved his life, or at least made it more bearable. The medical personnel in Vietnam, they didn't just deal with combat trauma. They also dealt with disease, and malaria was a big one. Malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, and Vietnam was full of mosquitoes, especially during the monsoon season when there was standing water everywhere. And despite taking anti-malarial medication, a lot of guys got malaria anyway. Kasky got malaria at least twice, based on the reference to malaria again, and malaria is miserable. You get high fevers, chills, sweating, headache, nausea. It knocks you out for days. And even after you recover, you can have relapses. So here's Kasky, working these brutal hours in the operating room, dealing with the stress and trauma of constant casualties, dealing with enemy attacks, And he's also sick with malaria. And he probably still has to work because they need every trained OR technician they can get. At some point, near the end of his tour, Kasky has back surgery, probably an injury from the physical demands of the work, or maybe from an attack. And then he gets malaria again. And it's time for him to go home. His tour is up, or maybe he's being medically evacuated, and he gets on a plane to fly back to the States. The flight home, it's supposed to be a relief. You're leaving the war zone. You're going back to America. You survived. But Kasky's flight home was almost a disaster. The airliner, probably another one of those chartered civilian planes, loses hydraulics mid-flight, which is a serious emergency. Without hydraulics, you can't control the plane properly, can't lower the landing gear, can't operate the flaps and brakes, and they nearly crash land in San Francisco. Imagine being on that plane. You've survived a year in Vietnam. You're almost home. And now, you might die in a plane crash over California. But they make it down. The pilots manage to land the plane safely. It's probably a rough landing, but everyone survives. And Kasky steps off the plane at San Francisco. And instead of a welcome home, he's greeted by a long line of protesters who curse him and spit on him. This is one of those experiences that Vietnam veterans talk about, the hostile reception they got when they came home. And whether it was as widespread as sometimes claimed is debatable, but it definitely happened to some guys, and Kasky was one of them. He just spent a year in hell working on dying soldiers, trying to save lives. He's sick with malaria. He's recovering from back surgery. He just nearly died in a plane crash, and people are spitting on him and calling him a baby killer and blaming him for the war. Not much of a welcome home. Not much recognition for what he'd done and sacrificed. When Kasky gets back home, he finds that nobody wants to talk about it. Even his family doesn't want to hear about Vietnam. And this was common. The American public was deeply divided over the war by the late 1960s and early 1970s. A lot of people opposed it. A lot of people were ashamed of it. And that shame extended to the veterans who fought it. Even though they hadn't made the decision to go to war, they just did what their country asked them to do. Kasky's family had been affected by this relentless shame heaped on the war and the veterans. They'd internalized the idea that Vietnam was something to be ashamed of, and so they didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to hear about what Terry had experienced, and he was left to deal with it alone. But Kasky knew the truth. He was no baby killer. He'd seen enough dying men working in army hospitals in Vietnam to know what that war was really about. It was about young American soldiers fighting and bleeding and dying, and medical personnel like him trying desperately to save them. And none of that had anything to do with the political controversies or the moral arguments about whether the war was just or unjust. He coped by drinking, and this is what a lot of Vietnam veterans did. They self-medicated with alcohol to numb the pain, to quiet the memories, to sleep at night. And it worked for a while, but it's not a sustainable solution. It creates its own problems. And Kasky probably struggled with alcohol for years. Then Desert Storm happens in 1991, and the American public's reaction to that war and those veterans is completely different. There are parades, there's yellow ribbon campaigns. Everyone is thanking the troops and celebrating them. And Kasky sees this, and it inspires him. He sees what a proper welcome home looks like, what it's like when a country honors its veterans instead of shaming them. And he decides to organize a reunion for his unit, for the guys he served with at the 22nd Surgical Hospital and the 95th Evacuation Hospital in Vietnam. This reunion, bringing together the people who shared that experience, who understood what he'd been through because they were there too, this begins an upward path for Kasky. This starts his recovery in a real way. The reunions become important to him, become something he looks forward to and draws strength from. Because when you're with people who were there, you don't have to explain, you don't have to justify. You can talk about it or not talk about it, but they understand. And that understanding is therapeutic in a way that nothing else is. At one of these reunions, Kasky meets one of the nurses he worked with in Vietnam, and she recognizes him by his eyes, which is an interesting detail because in the operating room they wore masks, of course, the whole surgical setup, so all you could see was people's eyes. And apparently this nurse remembered his eyes from all those years ago, remembered working with him, and they reconnect and probably share memories and help each other process what they went through. The reunions help Kasky cope with the memories of that time, memories like the case of the triple amputee whose life they saved but who was not yet safe from the enemy. This soldier lost 3 limbs, probably both legs and an arm, and the medical team at Kasky's hospital managed to save his life, got him stabilized, got him through the surgery. But even then, he wasn't safe, because the hospital could be attacked, could take rocket or mortar fire, and this soldier, who'd already been through so much, could be killed before he even got out of Vietnam. That's the reality of those field hospitals. You're trying to save lives, but you're doing it in a war zone where everyone is at risk, where the enemy could hit you at any time. Anything that could distract Kasky from the operating room was welcome. A USO show, playing ball, anything that could give him a mental break from the constant stream of casualties and the horror of the work. The USO, United Service Organizations, brought entertainment to the troops in Vietnam, shows with comedians and musicians and sometimes movie stars. And for a few hours, you could watch something and forget where you were and what was happening. Playing ball, probably baseball or basketball or just throwing a football around, physical activity that could burn off some of the stress and tension, give you something normal to focus on. But even with these distractions, Kasky sometimes had to stay up for days to cope with the relentless stream of casualties. You'd work one shift, then another, sleeping in snatches when you could, sometimes not at all. Running on adrenaline and coffee and sheer willpower because the wounded kept coming and they needed you. The human body can only take so much of this before it starts to break down. You get exhausted, you make mistakes, your judgment suffers. But you keep going, because what choice do you have? Those are American soldiers on those tables, and they deserve your best effort, even if you're running on fumes. The monsoon season in Vietnam, that made everything worse. The rain would come down in sheets. Everything was mud and water. The humidity was even more oppressive. And as I mentioned earlier, the standing water meant mosquitoes and disease, malaria and dengue fever, and other illnesses that added to the casualties the hospitals had to treat. The field hospitals during monsoon season, everything gets damp, nothing dries out, equipment starts to rust or malfunction, and you're still trying to do surgery, still trying to maintain sterile conditions, still trying to save lives in conditions that are far from ideal. And the dead bodies, that's another aspect of what Kasky dealt with. Not every casualty survived. Despite their best efforts, some guys died on the table or died before they even got to the hospital. And there had to be a process for handling the bodies, preparing them for shipment home. And that's another layer of trauma on top of everything else, having to deal with the dead as well as trying to save the living. The infections, That was a huge problem in Vietnam. The tropical environment, the nature of the wounds, the difficulty of maintaining sterile conditions, all of it meant that infection was a constant threat. You'd do surgery on a guy, get the wound cleaned out and closed up, and then days later, he'd develop an infection, and you'd have to do it all over again. Reopen the wound, clean it out, start antibiotics, hope the infection didn't kill him. Khe Sanh and the other OR personnel were dealing with this constantly, trying to prevent infections, trying to treat them when they happened, and watching guys die infections even after surviving the initial wound. This is one of the challenges of combat medicine that doesn't always get talked about. It's not just about the immediate trauma. It's about the complications that develop later, the infections and blood clots and organ failure, and all the other ways that a wound can kill you even after the initial crisis is over. The psychological toll on medical personnel in Vietnam was different from what combat troops experienced, but no less severe. Combat troops had the stress of combat, the fear of being killed or wounded, the moral weight of killing enemy soldiers, but medical personnel had their own unique trauma. They weren't usually doing the killing. They were trying to save lives, but they saw the results of war up close and personal in a way that even combat troops didn't always see. They saw young men torn apart. They saw the suffering. They heard the screams and the moans. They smelled the blood and the burned flesh. And they had to maintain their composure and their competence, even while being emotionally devastated by what they were witnessing. Khe Sanh was 20 years old going through this, just a kid himself. And the fact that he functioned at all, that he did his job day after day under those conditions, that's remarkable. But the cost was high. The PTSD, the nightmares, the emotional numbness, the difficulty connecting with people who hadn't been through it, the drinking, all of that was the price he paid for his service. Think about what motivated Khe Sanh in the first place. Watching combat on TV and wanting to be a medic, wanting to help wounded soldiers survive. That's a noble motivation. That's the best of what draws people to military service, the desire to serve, to help, to make a difference. And Khe Sanh got to do exactly what he wanted to do. He became a medic. He went to Vietnam. He worked on wounded soldiers and helped many of them survive. The fact that it cost him so much psychologically, the experience was so traumatic, that doesn't diminish what he accomplished or the value of what he did. Those soldiers whose lives he helped save, they got to go home. They got to live. They got to have families and careers and the rest of their lives. And that's because of medical personnel like Terry Khe Sanh, who were willing to work under impossible conditions to give them that chance. The 22nd Surgical Hospital and the 95th Evacuation Hospital, these units saved thousands of lives during the Vietnam War. The survival rate for American casualties who made it to a hospital in Vietnam was over 97%, which was higher than any previous war. And that's because of the skill and dedication of people like Khe Sanh. The field hospitals in Vietnam, the MASH units, they were a continuation of the mobile surgical hospital concept that was developed in Korea and refined in Vietnam. The idea was to get surgical capability as close to the fighting as possible, so that wounded soldiers could receive definitive surgical treatment within minutes or hours of being wounded, rather than having to be transported long distances first. This saved lives. The quick evacuation by helicopter to a nearby field hospital meant that guys who would have died in previous wars had a fighting chance to survive. But it also meant that the medical personnel at these field hospitals were exposed to more danger than medical personnel in rear area hospitals. They were subject to enemy attacks. They were living in primitive conditions. They were closer to the fighting and all the stress that came with that. Kasky at Phu Bai, watching the rockets come in, working during mortar attacks. That was the price of having surgical capability close to the front lines. The dual MOS that Kasky had, combat medic and operating room technician, that's interesting because it gave him versatility. He could be used in different roles depending on the need. Early in his tour, or at certain points, he might have been out with infantry units providing medical support in the field, responding to casualties during combat operations, setting up IVs and stopping bleeding and calling for medevac. And at other times, he's in the operating room, assisting with surgery. Both roles require different skills. Field medicine is about rapid assessment and life-saving interventions with limited equipment. Operating room work is more technical, more procedural, requires knowledge of surgical instruments and techniques, and having training in both made Kasky more valuable to the Army and probably gave him a more complete understanding of the continuum of care from the point of injury through definitive surgical treatment. The relationship between the medical personnel and the soldiers they treated, that's another aspect of this that's important to understand. The medical personnel weren't just doing a job. They cared deeply about the soldiers they were treating. They knew these were American kids who were wounded, serving their country. And they felt a tremendous responsibility to do everything possible to save them. When a soldier died despite their best efforts, the medical personnel took it personally, felt like they'd failed, even though in many cases, the wounds were simply too severe for anyone to survive. Kasky and the other medical personnel at his hospitals, they carried the weight of those deaths, remembered the faces, wondered if they could have done something differently. And that's a heavy burden to bear. But they also had the satisfaction of knowing that many of the soldiers they treated survived, went home, lived full lives, and that makes the sacrifice worthwhile, even if the personal cost was high. The anti-war movement's hostility toward Vietnam veterans, that's one of the more shameful episodes in American history. The way that young men who'd served honorably in a war they didn't start and didn't choose were blamed for that war and treated with contempt. Kasky experienced this directly, the spitting and cursing at the airport, the unwillingness of even his family to talk about his service, the general sense that Vietnam veterans were something to be ashamed of rather than honored. This was deeply unfair and deeply damaging. It contributed to the psychological trauma that Vietnam veterans experienced, made it harder for them to process their experiences and reintegrate into civilian life, and it left scars that are still visible today. The fact that Kasky coped by drinking, that he didn't get help for his PTSD for years, that's partly a result of the way the country treated Vietnam veterans, the message that their service didn't matter or was even shameful. And that's something we should remember and learn from so we don't repeat that mistake. The contrast between the welcome home Vietnam veterans got and the welcome home Desert Storm veterans got, that's stark, and it obviously affected Kasky deeply since it inspired him to organize the reunion that began his healing process. Desert Storm veterans came home to parades and celebrations. Vietnam veterans came home to protesters and indifference or hostility. And both groups of veterans served honorably and did what their country asked them to do. The difference was entirely in how the American public chose to respond. Kasky, seeing that difference, seeing what a proper welcome home looks like, that must have been painful in some ways, a reminder of what he didn't get. But it was also healing because it validated the idea that veterans deserve respect and gratitude regardless of the politics of the war they fought. And it motivated him to take action, to organize that reunion, to start building the connections and the community that would help him and his fellow veterans heal. The reunions that Kasky organized and attended, those became central to his ability to cope with his Vietnam experiences. The reunions keep him centered, he said. They provide a connection to people who understand. They allow him to remember and honor what he and his fellow medical personnel did. And they remind him that his service mattered, that the lives he helped save mattered, that he was part of something important, even if the larger outcome of the war was disappointing. Unit reunions for Vietnam veterans have become increasingly important as the years go by, as the veterans get older and start to think about legacy and meaning. And these gatherings provide a space where the truth of the experience is honored and the bonds formed in war are maintained. For someone like Kasky, who struggled for years with PTSD and drinking and isolation, the reunions are literally life-saving. They're what keeps him connected to his past in a healthy way, rather than being destroyed by it. You think about the specific images and memories that Kasky carries. The soldier who stepped on a landmine and lost multiple limbs. The triple amputee who survived surgery but was still in danger. The shift in the OR where he emerged covered in blood. The rockets tracking into his compound. The bullet holes in the airport terminal. The heat and the smell when he first arrived. The protesters spitting on him when he came home. These are the kinds of memories that don't fade, that stay vivid decades later. And for someone with PTSD, these memories can be intrusive, can come back unbidden, can trigger emotional responses that are overwhelming. The fact that seeing photos years later set off a PTSD episode for Kasky, that shows how powerful and persistent these memories are, how the trauma of Vietnam stayed with him long after he left the country. But it also shows that getting help, getting treatment from the VA, addressing the PTSD directly, that's possible and valuable and necessary. Before I close this out, let me just take a moment and reflect on what Terry Kasky represents and why his story matters. Kasky represents the thousands of medical personnel who served in Vietnam, the medics, and corpsmen and nurses and doctors and OR technicians who worked in incredibly difficult conditions to save American lives. These people don't get the recognition that combat troops get. They're not usually featured in war movies or documentaries, but their contribution was absolutely essential. They're the reason that so many wounded soldiers survived. They're the reason that families got their sons and husbands back alive. Kasky went to Vietnam because he wanted to help, because he'd seen medics on TV and thought that was meaningful work. And he ended up doing exactly that, working brutal hours under constant threat to give wounded soldiers a chance to survive. The cost to him personally was enormous. The PTSD, the drinking, the isolation, the difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. But he eventually found a path to healing through the reunions and through getting help from the VA. And now, he's able to look back on his service with some measure of pride and satisfaction even, though the memories are still painful. The medical personnel in Vietnam, they saw war at its most brutal and intimate. They dealt with the broken bodies and the suffering and the death, and they maintained their humanity and their compassion through it all. And that's something extraordinary, something that deserves our deepest respect and gratitude. Terry Kasky's story, it's a story of service and sacrifice, of trauma and healing, of a young man who wanted to help and who ended up giving more than anyone should have to give. And it's a reminder that the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, to include the people who tried to heal the wounds that war created.